Good evening, folks and Franz. Welcome to the Elakha Alliance webinar. Tonight's presentation is Kelp Communities in Transition, Consequences for Oregon's Marine Species of Greatest Need. So let me shut my door there real quick. Tonight we've got Dr. Steve Rumrell from Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. And before I pass it off to him, I'm just going to present a little bit about the Elakha Alliance and who we are super quickly. If you're not familiar, so the Elakha Alliance is a nonprofit based here in Oregon. Our goal is to restore Oregon's sea otter population to help our marine ecosystems. We were founded by the late David Hatch, who was a Siletz tribal member. So the cultural significance of returning sea otters is really important to us, as well as the ecological importance as a keystone species, and economically it would help benefit our coastal communities through ecotourism, and also just having a healthier ecosystem benefits everybody who depends on fin fisheries and shellfish and Dungeness crab and all that good stuff. We are a solid team of 3.5 full-time staff. So I like to say we're a little nonprofit, but making big waves for ocean conservation here in Oregon. So our mission is slightly updated as of last week. So our mission officially now is to make Oregon's marine and coastal ecosystems and communities more robust and resilient by restoring a healthy population of sea otters to the Oregon coast. So some background, we did publish a scientific feasibility study in 2022. These are the 5 key takeaways. We know that sea otter reintroduction has been very successful for the conservation of the species. We're looking into estuaries as well as kelp forests as reintroduction sites. And there's still a couple scientific information gaps that we are currently filling based on this feasibility study that we can talk about later. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service also published their own feasibility assessment of sea otter reintroduction in Northern California and Oregon as a joint effort. And so they ultimately concluded that reintroducing sea otters to Oregon is ecologically feasible and could have significant benefits for marine ecosystem health. However, successful reintroduction would obviously require careful planning, collaboration with stakeholders, and a solid management plan to address potential conflicts to ensure the best long-term success of the sea otter population in Oregon. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has not taken a position on whether to move forward or not. So that leads us to what are our next steps. We've heavily focused on U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to move forward, but we are kind of switching gears, which I'll talk about in a couple more slides. But currently, we're working really hard on advocacy, outreach, and public engagement to educate as many people as we can about the lack of sea otters in Oregon and why it's really important to bring them back. We're ramping up our political support. So if you would like to participate in helping write a letter to your legislators, you can scan that QR code right there. And we're also increasing our tribal engagement. The Siletz tribe just received a $1.56 million grant, federal grant, that we help them work with on that will help fund the next 3 years to work on a sea otter restoration plan with tribes in Oregon and Northern California and several other stakeholders. So that is some big, exciting news. We're also filling information research gaps based on our feasibility study. So doing some shark research with a Big Fish Lab, figuring out where white sharks are and are not on the Oregon coast, and doing a shell fisheries impact assessment as well. And so the Elakha Alliance is interested in exploring alternative strategies for restoring a population or populations of sea otters to Oregon, including innovative leadership models and partnerships that involve the state of Oregon and coastal tribes. And we will continue to support and facilitate U.S. Fish and Wildlife's decision-making and leadership, but we will also investigate the legal and policy landscape that could enable tribes or state entities to lead and or manage the restoration of sea otter population in Oregon. So how you can help real quick, you can sign up for our newsletter that will come directly from me once a month. You can also donate if you would like to help us continue our research and education and just spreading the message that sea otters are missing in Oregon and deserve to be back to help revitalize our marine ecosystems is really important. Quickly, we do have some upcoming events. If you want to take note, if you're in Portland, come say hi to me next week on March 19th at Lycum Brewery. Our board president, Bob Bailey, is giving a talk on the previous 1970s sea otter translocation in Coos Bay at the History Museum on April 1st. And no, that is not a joke. And then on April 12th, we are doing our largest fundraiser of the year, the Oregon Otter Beer Festival. We're about halfway sold out with tickets. So if you're interested, please scan that code or visit our website and join us for a really fun educational and beverage-induced evening. And we're across all the social media platforms. This presentation will be recorded and put up on our YouTube channel. So thank you if you're watching this in the future on our YouTube. And also quick thanks to our partners who are amazing, and we can't do this alone, so we appreciate your partnership. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce Dr. Steve Rumrell, who is the leader of the Shellfish Program at the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, where his team conducts habitat characterization, stock assessments, monitoring activities, and scientific studies for a diverse group of bay clams, razor clams, mussels, abalone, crab, shrimp, sea urchins, and other shellfish. Steve is a marine biologist, estuarine ecologist, and invertebrate zoologist who has been working in the Oregon coast for over 3 decades. He earned his PhD in zoology from the University of Alberta, where he investigated critical early life history events and natural mortality of echinoderms along the west coast of Vancouver Island. And his master's thesis was documented the reproductive biology of brittle stars in Monterey Bay. Super cool. That's amazing. So I'm going to pass this over to Steve and let him take the lead from here. Thanks for presenting with us tonight.
All right, thank you very much, Chanel. I also want to say thank you to Bob Bailey and Jane Bakary for this invitation to talk with you today. I also want to thank everyone here in the audience who's devoted some time and attention to listen to the story that I have to tell. I think it's an important story, and my overall goal is really just to share the work that has been undertaken by the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife to characterize the current status of our rocky reef habitats and their communities. So I'm going to speak about these shifting nearshore conditions and the consequences for Oregon's marine species of greatest conservation need. That's quite a mouthful, but that's the terminology that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has required of us to obtain funding and be able to support this work. So I'm Steve Rumrell, and I'm the leader for the ODFW Shellfish Program. Let's see. How can I'm going to be struggling with technology here for a second. No advance, Chanel.
You want to use, are you using the arrows on your, there you go, you got it.
That's for that. Okay. So I'm the leader for the Shellfish Program, and I'm a marine scientist, fisheries manager, and coastal resource policy advisor. My portfolio, as Chanel described, includes a whole bunch of different commercial shellfish, the Dungeness crab fisheries in the bay, the Oregon pink shrimp fisheries, sea urchins, bay clams, razor clams, and also a big portfolio on the recreational side, Dungeness crab, red rock crab, abalone, bay clams, razor clams, a whole bunch of different organisms here that are under my purview. Whoops. All right. So the preamble here is that the nearshore ocean conditions are changing along the west coast of North America. And we are seeing recent shifts in ocean drivers that have contributed to broad-scale impacts to marine and estuarine habitats. And unfortunately, there have been consequences for several of Oregon's marine species of greatest conservation need. Now, the particular change that I'm going to talk about here is one that we've all heard lots about, and that's that transition in habitats from a healthy kelp forest with three-dimensional structure, kelp communities, subsurface and rising up to the surface, populated by fish and other invertebrates, and that transition to a much simpler system where kelp is lost, understory seaweeds are gone, and it's dominated by sea urchins. So here are the players in this system, and I'll just touch base on them here and then dwell on them in a little bit more detail as I go along. But starting with that very significant marine heat wave back in 2014, 2015, 2016, and persisting through several years of unusually warm water. In concert with that, then we saw the increased abundance of purple sea urchins and the formation of sea urchin barrens. Many of those sea urchins are in a starved or undernourished condition that their gonads have not developed. Concurrent with that rise in sea urchins and the marine heat waves, we experienced massive mortality of sea stars 2013 through 2015 and continuing at lower levels through the present. Coupled with that, the decline in red abalone over that same time period and the patchy demise of bull kelp, which has also persisted into the present. Those are the key habitats that we're talking about here. Uh-oh, now my mouse isn't working. All right. Yeah, there we go. Sorry about that. So the overall goal is to present a summary of the work by the ODFW Marine Resources Program to characterize the current status and historic changes to our subtidal rocky reef communities. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about shifting baselines and metrics of change. I'll spend a little bit of time talking about the primary ocean drivers, warmer ocean waters along our coast. And then I'll chat a little bit about the Oregon Nearshore Conservation Strategy and the species of greatest conservation need. Then I'll describe the new surveys and new work to describe the ecological consequences for bull kelp, abalone, sea urchins, and sea stars, and then finally finish off with some key questions for the future. So the take-home message is that the magnitude of ecological change in Oregon's rocky reef habitat is really unprecedented in recorded history. Some key questions for us as marine scientists, advocates, and interested folks along the coast is that do these current communities represent a shifting baseline or a new normal for Oregon's rocky reef habitats? Second question, will the community continue to respond and adapt into an alternate stable state? And third question, what about resilience? Is it possible to help sea otters, abalone, sea stars, and kelp to assist with the recovery? I want to start with a personal anecdote here. That group, that wonderful family right in the middle, those are my grandparents, and that cute gal in the middle is my mother. And they grew up, that photograph was taken back in 1938 down in Pacific Grove, where this family grew up. Down in Pacific Grove in the 1930s, there was lots and lots and lots of abalone. Red abalone, black abalone were very abundant. And my mother talks about stories that she had abalone so often that she just found it distasteful. She said, can't we stop having abalone for dinner? I'd like to have chicken or a hot dog or something like that. Abalone was so abundant, it was not appreciated by the local families down there. Now, when we think about shifting baselines as metrics of changes, an important problem is that these important long-term changes go unrecognized because generations accept the situation in which they were raised as normal. And that's this shifting baseline situation where a shifting baseline is a metric of change measured against a previous reference point. And we have continual erosion of accepted thresholds for environmental conditions just because we accept that which was raised up to us at our early formative stages in our career. And I just put together this hypothetical histogram just looking at changes in the abundance of red abalone declining down through the 1800s, 1900s into the 2000s. I was raised up as a scientist in the 1970s. So my perceived baseline is what I experienced as a young scientist, coupled with those anecdotes of stories from my grandparents and mother. Now we have, thinking about shifting baselines, very important work by Dr. Pauly back in 1995, his paper, Anecdotes in the Shifting Baseline Syndrome of Fisheries. And the key quote out of that paper is that each generation of fisheries scientists accepts as baseline the stock size and species composition that occurred at the beginning of their careers, and we use that to evaluate changes. Another very important paper put together by Paul Dayton and his colleagues back in 1998, and that paper, Sliding Baselines, Ghosts, and Reduced Expectations in Kelp Forest Communities. The key quote there, patterns and mechanisms observed over 25 years in a large kelp forest suggest that a definition of a meaningful benchmark is impossible because many of the large animals have been gone for years to decades, and kelps are sensitive to large-scale, low-frequency El Nino southern oscillation events and longer-term regime shifts. That quote, put together back in 1998, is as relevant then as it is now. We could quote that today. So what about alternate stable states? What are those? And those are different configurations for an ecosystem that could be maintained by the same external conditions. And the transition from one state into another occurs after major perturbation. That perturbation could be marine heat waves or episodic recruitment of sea urchins or other marine organisms, or perhaps loss of key predators such as sea otters or the predatory sunflower sea stars. Graphically, we see this graphic in the middle where we shift from the stable condition at the bottom of one of those valleys into another alternate stable state, going over some type of critical threshold. And that prompts us to think about resilience. What are the factors that push the system from one state into another and that maintain it in this alternate state against shifting back into that other initial state? And we think about that kind of situation for the transition of coral reefs into being dominated by macroalgae, in the kelp forest situation that we're talking about, into barrens dominated by sea urchins, or macroalgae shifting over into turf. So let's dig into the particulars now, starting with the ocean drivers and marine heat waves and warming along the West Coast. The two graphs in front here just show the formation of that blob of unusually warm seawater way back in 2014 and its persistence along our coastline for several years. Marine heat waves like this disrupt nearshore marine ecosystems, and the reported impacts have been altered primary productivity in the water column, the proliferation and intensity of harmful algal blooms along our coastline, the displacement of ocean habitats, and what I'm going to talk about, changes to populations of marine species and disruption of the commercial and recreational fisheries. Here I just updated that graphic just to show the reduced intensity now this year. So that blob of warm water shifted south, and we now have normal, relatively normal water along our coastline, but still some warm south offshore waters along the offshore areas. This graphic shows the retrospective analysis of sea surface temperature anomalies along the California current. And the graph on the top just shows years from 1982 up to 2025. And you can see that the percent of the exclusive economic zone that was unusually warm had its ups and downs throughout the 80s and into the 90s, some red zones associated with El Nino warmer water in 1992 and 1997. But then as you shift into that period from 2013, 2014 to the present, wow, lots and lots of warming events and major areas of our exclusive economic zone offshore characterized by unusually warm seawater. There's another way to look at that. So this graphic here shows the coastline of Washington, Oregon, California, divided up into 5 regions along the left. And then in the colors in the middle of these bars showing the percent of each region that is in that extent of marine heat wave. And what you can see here is that the coastline of Oregon in zone 2 shows unusually high levels of marine heat wave water. And same thing for zone 3, Northern California. And it's to somewhat a lesser extent, that region of the central California coast from San Francisco down to Point Conception, also characterized by unusually warm seawater. those are the sections of our coast that were hardest hit by these marine heat waves and warm seawater, much to a lesser extent off the coast of Washington or down in Southern California. And then finally, the blob tracker, NOAA, a wonderful website, has just shown that the remnants of the large marine heat wave that we recently experienced from April to August 2024 now dissipated. The heat wave decreased in 2024, and we're in current El Nino Southern Oscillation neutral status for this winter, and the forecast is for cooler La Nina conditions during the winter of 2025. These graphs show some time series measurements of wind stress and seawater temperature and salinity at the Cape Perpetua Marine Reserve off the central Oregon coast. What did we really experience back in 2015? And what you're looking at here, just focus in on those red arrows looking at seawater temperature. We saw unusual seawater temperatures in July 9th through 17th, from August 11th through 18th, and August 28th through September 10th. Total of 28 days of very unusually warm seawater back in 2015. And another way, just looking at that Oregon in hot water, you can look at those historic conditions along the bottom there, these years, 2012 to 2020. And again, the high amount of warm water in 2014, 2015, 2016, and then these persistent warming events that have come through along the coastline over the past years. So how did the marine heat waves impact the ecological communities in our shallow rocky reef habitats? And we have to ask that question, what are Oregon's marine species of greatest conservation need? The species of greatest conservation need is a term put together by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And those are species that are designated in our state wildlife action plans as species most in need of conservation actions. So Oregon's put together our conservation plan using those terms, and the criteria for identifying species of greatest conservation need. They can be Endangered Species Act threatened or endangered status, species characterized by low abundance or declining populations, species that are losing habitat or are exposed to threats of disturbance, but they can also be ecologically important or culturally important species. So ODFW has put together that plan, and we update it every 10 years. So the Oregon Wildlife Action Plan was put together in 2016, and the overall purpose is providing the overarching strategy to conserve fish and wildlife in Oregon, with the goals to maintain healthy fish and wildlife populations, maintain and restore functioning habitats, prevent declines of at-risk species, and reverse declines in wildlife resources. The Nearshore conservation strategy also has a distinct purpose to promote actions to restore ecological functions and nearshore resources to provide long-term benefits to current and future generations of Oregonians. The Oregon Nearshore Conservation Strategy, the 2016 version, recognized distinct ecoregions along the coast, identified conservation issues and priorities, articulates the limiting factors and recommended approaches, and then characterizes the strategy species, at that time, 88 species, and identifies opportunities for conservation. We're now in the final stages of putting together the revised conservation strategy, and that draft will be released very soon. And the nearshore species of greatest conservation need in the new draft include 5 species of marine mammals and also proposed sea otters, 12 species of seabirds and shorebirds, 18 species of fishes, 17 species of marine invertebrates, and 4 species of algae and plants, including bull kelp. And for each of these species of greatest conservation need, articulating their special needs, limiting factors, data gaps, and conservation actions. So I'm going to shift now and spend a little bit of time describing our new work to characterize and fill data gaps to address the recent declines in the species of greatest conservation need, in particular urchins, abalone, sunflower sea stars, and their primary kelp and rocky reef habitat along the Oregon coast. This is a grant project that we received grant funds from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service under the competitive state wildlife grant program. And it provided funds for us to fulfill 3 objectives. First objective was to characterize the current status of those priority species with scuba surveys and advanced underwater imaging in shallow and deep water habitats. The second was to determine the location and spatial extent of rocky reef kelp habitat with high resolution aerial photography to contribute to development of an adaptive kelp monitoring program for Oregon. And third, to generate new time series data to measure variability in key nearshore parameters and potential stressors to provide the context for these recent shifts. So there are those species of greatest conservation need, including red abalone, red sea urchins, sunflower sea stars, flat abalone, purple sea urchins, and bull kelp. And here again are those players that I talked about. And so I'm going to just walk us through how we believe that these interactions are taking place, and focusing in on the marine heat wave, increased abundance of sea urchins, massive mortality of sea stars, decline in abalone, and the patchy demise of bull kelp. So here's what we think really is a working hypothesis. So beginning in the upper right, thinking about shifting ocean conditions and as a manifestation of climate change, and that manifestation of a marine heat wave that persisted for many years along good sections of our coastline, we believe that the marine heat wave was responsible for the decline in bull kelp, and in particular maybe tied up in decreased spore production and growth. Somehow marine heat wave, warmer waters, maybe disruptive of currents and larval retention, may have an influence on larval production and the massive recruitment, resulting in an increase in sea urchins. Somehow the marine heat wave and warmer waters also responsible for the mass mortality of sea stars, somehow perhaps tied up in the virus or disrupting microbial function along the epidermis of sea stars, contributing to the sea star wasting syndrome and decline in multiple species of populations. And with the decline in predatory sea stars, that may have released sea urchins from predation, which added more intense grazing pressure on kelp and continuing to add to the decline of bull kelp and understory seaweed. And then finally, the intense grazer pressure from grazing sea urchins, contributing to competition for food with abalone and contributing to their decline as well. So these are really some of the proximate and distal relationships that we believe are maybe taking place here. However, all of this took place a good decade ago, and so it's very difficult for us to go back and prove anything. So we're really just doing some post facto assessment. So let's start focusing on kelp. So kelp beds, as we know, provide ecologically important benefits and habitat in shallow rocky reef areas. Kelp is responsible for primary production, nutrient cycling, and carbon storage. Kelp beds provide complex three-dimensional heterogeneous structure. They're hotspots for marine biodiversity, provide habitats for seaweed, invertebrates, fishes, marine mammals, and they also buffer exposed coastline from waves and storms. Now, bull kelp is an annual species with roughly a 1-year lifespan. Of course, it grows on rocky substrata and wave-exposed areas down to depths of about 40 meters. It's an annual species, and the blades can persist a little over a year, 18 months. And the sporophyte, the big adult, if you will, stage of bull kelp produces spores on these patches along the coastline or on the blades themselves. And those spores drop off, shown in the yellow circle, and lead to these microscopic gametophyte and sporophyte stages that then have to grow up. And those very young microscopic stages are also vulnerable to grazing, not only by sea urchins, but by other organisms. Now, bull kelp beds are naturally highly variable, both in space and time along the Oregon coast. The Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife has been monitoring kelp beds for many, many years. And we've seen substantial reduction at some sites immediately after the heat wave in 2014, 2015. The two photographs on the right show Orford Reef in 2014 when it was characterized by abundant bull kelp. And then 2 years later, Orford Reef offshore, 2016, very little bull kelp. So places where we've seen substantial reduction, Orford Reef, Blanco Reef, Humbug Mountain down in Brookings area. Our ODFW, with those funds from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, we paid for contractors to do aerial surveys of bull kelp beds in 2022 and again in 2024, flying the Newport region, 17 miles along the coast there, 34 miles down along the Coos Bay region, and 177 miles overall from Cape Arago down to California. And so we've characterized and have new high resolution aerial photographs of kelp there. What we've seen is that spatial variability along the coastlines when we compare 2010 spatial extent to 2022. And overall, 66% reduction in comparison to the spatial extent of bull kelp in our coastal waters from 2010. And as you can see, some places like Orford Reef or the Blanco Reef, substantial reductions, lots of bull kelp there in 2010, very little in 2022. But other areas like Rogue Reef, hardly any drop there. And other areas like Redfish Rocks, hardly any change. Cape Arago, in fact, an increase in the abundance of bull kelp there. So it's patchy, and we're scratching our heads about that. Our statewide reduction of about 66% is in contrast to what's been reported for Northern California, 90% coastwide. Here's just a couple examples here down in the Brookings area. In 2022, our comparison there showed about 80% reduction in comparison with 2010. And you can see that on the left, the surface and subsurface kelp in 2010, virtually all gone down there at Chetco Point, Macklin Cove. Another series of photographs here showing the Blanco Reef area. We had about 162 hectares there in 2010, reduced down to only 15 hectares in 2022. Overall, about 90% reduction in that time period. So substantial loss there. The Blanco Reef area down near Cape Blanco, very similar to what's been reported for Northern California. We've done the surveys in 2022, and I mentioned again in 2024. So some areas where kelp has persisted, Cape Arago, hardly any change there. And we've got new aerial imagery, so we're working on the analysis there. And again, the Rogue Reef area where there was some drop there in 2022. And I hate to report that it looks like there's been some substantial drop there in 2024. Now, what do we know about bull kelp and its thermal tolerances? Ideal temperature in that cold range of 10 to 12 degrees centigrade with maximum growth at about 12 degrees. Some evidence that bull kelp may exhibit some localized adaptation to shifting thermal regimes. I mentioned that bull kelp produces spores on the specialized patch on their blades. And here are just some photographs of the microscopic gametophyte and microscopic sporophytes that grow up from those spores. So in this microscopic stage, we really don't know that much about their ecology or susceptibility to grazing. But we do know from some good work done in 2023, a master's student down in Sonoma State, that warm seawater results in poor success of the small kelps. I won't go into this in much detail, but on the left, the sporophytes showed greater size in low temperature seawater, greater spatial cover in cold seawater, and the gametophytes also showed greater size in cold water and greater spatial cover in cold water. So warm seawater results in poor success of these very susceptible microscopic stages of kelp. Okay, so I talked about warm seawater and the decreased spore production and growth, perhaps contributing to the decline of bull kelp. Let's shift over to now talk about sea star wasting and the significant decline for multiple species of sea stars. The problem is that many species of sea stars experienced mass mortality along the West Coast beginning in 2013 due to what we're calling sea star wasting syndrome. And that disease or syndrome is coincident with changing ocean conditions. Some species of sea stars, like the ochre star, the purple and orange ones along the rocky intertidal, have largely recovered, but others, like the big Pycnopodia sunflower sea star and the other multi-rayed predatory soft-bodied sea stars like the Solaster group, have not recovered. And this is unfortunate. Many sea stars are recognized to be ecologically important as top-level predators in marine communities. Sunflower sea stars in particular have drawn our attention as important predators that prey upon sea urchins and other organisms in rocky subtidal habitats. And the onset of disease and death was coincident with the marine heat wave of 2013. And we know that healthy sunflower sea stars can consume fairly large numbers of sea urchins. So it makes sense to be concerned about them. Here are just some graphics showing the time series of measurements of sunflower sea stars in Washington, Oregon, and California. Those were cooking along at decent numbers in the early 2000s, 2004 up to 2014, and then dramatic drop. In Washington, we lagged behind by a year here in Oregon, but also a dramatic drop between 2014 and 2015. California, dramatic drop 2013 to 2014. The graph with all the yellow dots in the middle shows the location of federal NOAA trawl surveys, which pick up sunflower sea stars. 700 trawl surveys back in 2016, no Pycnopodia in those. So really a characterization of 100% declines in California, 99% drop in Washington. Coast-wide, about 90% throughout their range from Alaska down to Baja, decline after sunflower or the massive loss of sea stars due to wasting syndrome. They're red listed as critically endangered back in 2019, meaning that urgent action is needed. And sunflower sea stars are currently under consideration by NOAA for Endangered Species Act listing. And that has been a pending decision for a couple of years. We expected that final decision in 2024, certainly should be here by 2025. Along the Oregon coast, we've experienced about a 98% drop in the population, really beginning back perhaps as early as 2011, 2012, but definitely dropping between 2014 and 2015. And so that was really a multi-year decline stretching from 2012 over 2018. And some good news that juveniles have been observed substantial numbers, 50, 60 or so over 2023 and 2024. So we're getting some recruits from somewhere and hoping that they will persist. Now, being a larval biologist, I always worry about the reproduction of these animals. So I just need to characterize that we think about the adult sunflower stars have separate sexes, they're broadcast spawners, and they have a planktotrophic microscopic feeding larva that's out in the water column for periods of 45 to 60 days. We really don't know much about these microscopic stages or where they go, the larval supplies or settlement, nor very much at all about these recently metamorphosed post-larvae or juveniles. Okay, so I talked a little bit about the decline in sea stars. Let's shift our attention now over to sea urchins. So the situation is that many of the areas that were previously occupied by kelp beds and complex understory seaweeds now currently support little kelp. And we've seen a shift from the kelp bed to the urchin barrens. This is a complex process. Are we seeing, as I talked about in the beginning, alternate stable states or some kind of ecosystem phase shift? And I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to show these videos, but ODFW has been doing scuba surveys with videos to characterize the community composition in areas that in the past are normal habitat, going back to those same scuba sites in 2019 that have converted over into urchin barrens. So we've seen the community in the past characterized by high diversity, lots of algal biomass, several sea stars in those areas, few sea urchins. Now the community shift. So these areas are now barrens with little algal biomass, few sea stars, and lots of sea urchins. This change along our coastline got the national attention, and so the dramatic increase in urchins along the Oregon coast was described by ABC News. Swarms of sea urchins wreak destruction along the west coast, and the subtitle there was "An explosion of sea urchins off California coast decimated bull kelp at an unprecedented rate, and the creatures are now spreading to Oregon." Now that doesn't make sense. The sea urchins did not crawl from California to Oregon. We saw episodic recruitment of microscopic larvae settling along our coastline and growing, surviving, and growing up. Our 2019 surveys showed that about 350 million new purple urchins at Orford Reef alone, and those were from a massive episodic recruitment event rather than crawling up the coastline. An important question, of course, is release from predation by sea stars responsible somehow for the dramatic increase in purple sea urchins? Now, we've seen, and I've described it, the decreased abundance of sunflower sea stars. That decreased in abundance extends to other species like Pisaster brevispinus, a giant pink star, and also to multiple species of other large-bodied, soft-bodied predatory sea stars in the Solaster group. We ended up seeing overall fairly little change in other species like Pisaster ocraceus along the rocky shore and the blood stars such as Henricia, and then increased abundance in red sea urchins, dramatic increase in purple sea urchins, and also in the leather star, Dermasterius imbricata. Some weird things going on, and it's a little more complex. Thinking about sea urchins, like the sea stars, they are also separate sexes as adults and broadcast spawn their eggs and sperm out into the ocean. They have microscopic planktotrophic or feeding larval stages that develop in the water column for a long period of time, 40 to 60 days. And so the key points that we have to think about in terms of their populations are the factors that contribute to larval supplies, the settlement of these microscopic larvae, the metamorphosis or change from a swimming organism into a sea urchin body, and then the recruitment, the growth of those animals up to the point where we recognize them in our surveys. So here's just a couple of histograms that show these concurrent changes, the decline in sunflower sea stars along our coastline in that period from 2011, 2012, 2013, coupled with the increase in abundance of red sea urchins, dramatic increase really 2015 to 2016, and the purple sea urchins increasing in abundance 2016 to 2019. We're guessing back, when did that microscopic settlement episodic event take place? Perhaps in that period of 2012 for red sea urchins, and perhaps around 2014 for the purple sea urchins. And I just want to point that out here. So again, more histograms showing the changes in density or abundance of red and purple sea urchins at Orford Reef from 1984 up to 2024. And you can see that we've had some fairly low abundance of red sea urchins down through the early 90s, 95 or so. And we were in fact concerned about that. We may not get recruitment, and that reached that lowest density immediately before episodic recruitment in 2014, 2015, 2016. So we had high abundance back in the 80s before the start of commercial sea urchin fishery, and high abundance 2016 through 2024 after the marine heat wave. And what was going on before 1984, we don't know. Our teams are out tracking the abundance, but also the size frequency of the populations so that we can try to sort out when did episodic settlement occur, and then following the growth over these periods of 2 to 3, 4 to 5 years, and the maturation of these long-lived animals over time. Our new surveys, supported by the Fish and Wildlife Service grant and also by the Oregon Ocean Science Trust, have allowed us to focus also on new study areas in rocky reef habitats. So we're looking at the historic location and spatial extent of kelp beds from Cape Arago to the California border. Our study areas in and around Cape Arago, down in the Cape Blanco and Orford Reef area, offshore at Rogue Reef, and down at Mac Arch and Chetco Point down off of Brookings. What we can see here in work done in collaboration with the Oregon Institute of Marine Biology, Aaron Galloway's lab, we've got substantial variability in the densities of red and purple sea urchins along the southern Oregon coast in 2022, series of scuba dives done there. What you can see are high abundance, higher densities in purple sea urchins in comparison to red urchins, and high abundance at certain locations like Lighthouse Beach, Gregory Point at Cape Arago, high abundance at Macklin Cove and Chetco Point down in Brookings, but not so high at Middle Cove and North Cove, Simpson's Reef, or out at Sunset Bay. So there's quite a bit of spatial variability. So our project is looking at the changes in sea urchin populations at a whole series of sites, 20 different sites. We're conducting 51 different scuba surveys all along these areas. And we're also using small remotely operated vehicle, the Blue Robotics Blue ROV, which is a small ROV that we can deploy over the side to go down and look at these deeper rocky reef areas. So 185 dives with the ROV in multiple locations down along the southern Oregon coast. So just some snapshots of what that looks like. So this is a small ROV, lots of troubleshooting on the vessel to keep that going. But here are some pictures of those habitats taken over the last bit. So you can see abundant big purple urchins down in and mixed groups of red and purple urchins in deep water, 20 to 25 meters, no drift algae, and the sea urchins appear to be actively foraging. Okay, I'm going to shift now as I wrap this up to focus a little bit on the decline in abalone. So red abalone are large marine snails that inhabit shallow rocky reef areas. Their biogeographic range extends from Cape Arago down into Baja, so they're up at the northern natural limit of their natural geographic range, and the density is currently greatest in Northern California. California Department of Fish and Wildlife has been conducting surveys in Northern California. You can see all of their dots, and you can see the study sites that we've been looking at as well. Now, abalone are popular targets for recreational fisheries, not necessarily for the meat, but really for the trophy shells. Red abalone are the largest species of abalone in the world, and they grow to their largest sizes at the polar range extents. And the Oregon red abalone are the largest abalone in the world. So trophy hunting for red abalone is a popular activity. It's also difficult, dangerous, and competitive. We're seeing, have seen low densities of red abalone in Oregon. You can see in this table, just showing the densities in Brookings and Port Orford and the decline. Back in 2015, our surveys, underwater surveys, encountered 54 red abalone and 53 purple sea urchins. In 2022, that had dropped to 11 abalone along that same site and 11,000 purple sea urchins. And we're also seeing the abalone emerge out of the protective cracks and crevices, migrating, foraging around, starving, and succumbing, finding those empty shells. Work done by Kendall Smith and our staff when she was a graduate student took a look at the population structure of the red abalone in Oregon, compared that to California. And the Oregon abalone exhibit a high level of genetic similarity with California. We believe that the red abalone in Oregon are part of a very large regional metapopulation. So the Oregon subgroup is not self-sustaining, but we believe relies on periodic input of planktonic larvae from California. What are the factors that contribute to all of this? The red abalone naturally occur at very low densities in the northern limit of their biogeographic range. Those low densities, we believe, are below the critical threshold for successful reproduction. Poor environmental conditions now are contributing to problems. The Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission, at our request, suspended sport harvest in 2018 to 2024 and indefinitely closed these fisheries in 2023. And we developed a conservation fisheries management plan for red abalone extending out over the next decade. So I would say hats off to our Fish and Wildlife Commission that understood the magnitude of this problem and took that difficult step to suspend the recreational abalone fishery in Oregon indefinitely and to adopt our conservation and fisheries management plan. So the key factors that have contributed to decline: the low densities result in poor reproductive success. The clustered abalone are easy targets for harvest. Very little food for foraging abalone. The kelp beds are reduced at most sites, some sites after the marine heat wave. The increase in purple sea urchins has led to competition for food. Sea star wasting syndrome has contributed to the absence of significant urchin predators. And of course, sea otters are missing from our nearshore habitats. Bunch of problems. So these really have contributed to this transition of healthy kelp forests into now these areas that are dominated by sea urchins. So to conclude here, and as I wrap this up, our rocky reef habitats and communities have experienced substantial shifts over the past decade along the Oregon coast. These changing ocean conditions and ocean warming are likely a primary driver for this transition. The changes include a decline in kelp, mass mortality of sunflower sea stars, dramatic increase in the number and abundance of sea urchins, and a decline in abalone. And these trophic cascades or shifts in the food web in the kelp habitat are complex and warrant further study. The Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, our colleagues and co-workers at the Oregon Kelp Alliance, Oregon State University, the University of Oregon, Reef Check Oregon, and others are now engaged in surveys, research, and monitoring to establish these new baselines. So my final thoughts regarding the climate and ocean drivers: persistent marine heat waves and warming ocean waters are a regional manifestation of climate change, and the shifting ocean drivers exert multiple stressors on the marine habitats and communities along the Oregon coast. And these casualties include the alteration of our marine and estuarine communities, loss of sea stars, increased sea urchins, decline in the spatial extent of bull kelp, decline in the abundance of abalone, and others: increased harmful algal blooms and closure of shellfish fisheries, patchy decline in eelgrass, and also the increased abundance of non-indigenous green crab. We need research and monitoring to determine these mechanistic cause and effect relationships and also to document the impacts and their resilience. So the final take-home message: again, the magnitude of ecological change in our rocky reef habitat is unprecedented in Oregon's history. And do these current communities represent shifting baselines and new normals? Will the community continue to respond and adapt into an alternate stable state? And what about resilience? Is it possible to help sea otters, abalone, sea stars, and kelp to help assist with recovery of these systems? And I think with that, I'm just going to stop here. We are allowing and helping groups with the culling, active culling and removal of sea urchins. We are working with the Oregon Kelp Alliance to conduct culling as a conservation tool. And the Orca group of volunteer divers have removed about 87,000 sea urchins from Nellie's Cove over the past several years, been able to decrease the abundance of sea urchins, but bull kelp hasn't yet developed, come back there. And it's complicated to get that done with a scientific take permit. We brought this forward to the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission for action in February, and they took action to revise the Oregon administrative rules to authorize controlled culling of sea urchins in priority areas at Macklin Cove down in Brookings, Nellie's Cove at Port Orford, and up at Gowanda at Pacific City. Those are coupled with underwater surveys before and after culling to see whether or not culling by humans can help with this situation. So with that, I want to just leave that question: to what extent can culling of sea urchins by scuba divers function similar to sea otters to reduce densities of urchins, help reduce grazing pressure, and help facilitate the growth of seaweeds and kelp? We're working with the group to address that question with culling right now. So with that, I'm going to stop and just open this up for questions or concerns. And thank you again for the invitation to speak. And and for your attention today. I appreciate the chance to share that story. Pass back to you, Chanel.
All right. Thanks, Steve. That
Yes.
was incredible. I definitely learned something new, which is always great when we have these presentations. We do have several questions for you lined up. Someone asks, how do you differentiate between shifting baselines and evolutionary adaptation?
Yes. So, evolutionary adaptation takes place over many generations through natural selection, and certainly we can see some of that going on with increased pressure here. The shifting baseline issue is really a people issue about our perspectives about what's normal and what's abnormal. And because we don't have really good, solid, quantitative historical records for many of these species that I'm talking about, or the habitats here, in particular along Oregon, we don't have a lot of scuba divers down in these areas. So we suffer from that shifting baseline paradigm. And I just told my own story. I'm fortunate that I've got, stories in my personal life from my grandparents and parents about the abundance of abalone. But my colleagues who raised up at that same time period, who don't have that personal connection, really relate to what they learned when they were coming through their academic training or gaining their firsthand glimpses and experiences in this marine world as divers or coming along the coast. So shifting baseline is really a human perception problem compared to a longer term evolutionary change in the genetic structure of these organisms in response to stressors.
And we've got another one. Do we know anything about predation of urchin larvae when they are in the water column?
Hey, I love whoever asked that question. That was the focus for my PhD dissertation. So I looked specifically at who eats sea urchin larvae, and it turns out that crabs do. Crab larvae eat sea urchin larvae. And anyways, I looked at a whole bunch of those things and found lots of different predator-prey interactions in these microscopic stages. Later larvae generally less susceptible to being preyed upon by zooplankton, and they're preyed upon by carnivorous zooplankton, also by chaetic gnats and gelatinous zooplankton. Great question. I love that. Thank you for asking that.
All right. Why are purple sea urchins listed as a species of greatest conservation need, given they now dominate many nearshore habitats?
Yes, so we put them down. Remember that it was not just about abundance or threats to their population, but ecological importance. And purple sea urchins are, of course, very ecologically important, as are red urchins as well. So, so that's a criteria that is different from an Endangered Species Act concern about declines in the populations. Ecological, cultural importance as well for species of greatest conservation need.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Did you mention that sea stars might be making a comeback?
Yeah. So, even though the sea star wasting has persisted for over a decade, we've seen general recovery of the ochre sea stars. The orange and purple sea stars have recovered to some pretty decent numbers at some sites, and other animals like the sunflower sea star have not. And same thing, we're concerned about those that don't draw very much attention, the large-bodied, predatory, multi-rayed solasters, Solaster stimsoni, Solaster dawsoni, some of the crossaster, other species that may not have recovered at all. So, there's a differential recovery going on.
All right, we have one more question. We're just 1 minute over time, so hopefully this will be the last one. I may help you answer this possibly. Given the lack of kelp for protection, the presence of great whites, orcas, and taking up to 20 years to reach carrying otter capacity, do you think that the release of otters in estuaries might be safer to the otters themselves and our threatened offshore abalone?
Yes. So as we know, by looking at Californian elkhorn slough, the deliberate introduction of surrogate mother pup pairs into elkhorn slough has been successful, and we may, have some successes along those kind of lines in the Oregon basin estuaries. Prey resources would likely be impacted. We have, crab and bay clams and shrimp in our estuaries that could serve as a source of food, and it may protect those, sea otters from predation by sharks. Some of the work that Elakha is undertaking now with the Big Fish Lab is looking at shark predation and incidents along our coast. And I believe, is that right, Chanel, that that poor sea otter at Yaquina Head that succumbed was likely a shark predation event?
Yeah,
Shark,
that was
shark
in
damage.
2021.
Yeah,
He washed ashore with a shark bite wound. Unfortunately, it was fatal. The Oregon Coast Aquarium did try to rehab him, but the shark bit right on his spinal column on his neck. So that
yeah.
was unfortunate. But yeah, it's white sharks don't actually eat sea otters. They take investigative bites, thinking that they're a fat-covered seal or sea lion, which is what they would rather eat, and get a fur ball and then just let go. And unfortunately, that's usually pretty fatal for the sea otter. But yeah, we asked the Big Fish Lab to kind of figure out where white sharks hang out in Oregon, so we don't release a population of sea otters into some unknown, white shark territory.
So I think the big picture is yes, the planning that's being undertaken here, thinking about reintroduction of sea otters along the Oregon coast, is taking a sophisticated look at a diversity of habitats, including estuaries, as well as these rocky reef areas that I described today.
Yeah,
That's a whole other seminar. Yeah.
yeah, I'll just add quickly. So Dr. Tim Tinker, who is a statistical genius and sea otter also genius. He worked on our feasibility study on an Oregon sea otter model, taking in all the suitability factors to bring sea otters back to Oregon in certain locations, and figuring out the likelihood of success over a 10-year period. And he is working on an updated model, including Northern California and updated Oregon data for that. That should come out this year. So there are some new places that weren't listed in our feasibility study that could be potential reintroduction sites, including some other estuaries. But there is still suitable kelp forest habitat for sea otters to be reintroduced in Oregon, on top of multiple estuaries as well, thanks to a lot of research from Dr. Brent Hughes at the Elkhorn Slough estuary. We know how amazing the interconnectedness of estuary health and sea otters being there benefit that ecosystem. And then I'll also just add one more thing, that sea otters eat about 50,000 to 120,000 European green crabs a year. One sea otter does in the Elkhorn Slough, which could really help Oregon combat that invasive species, because I think I'm correct in the statement, Steve, that European green crab do eat juvenile Dungeness crab. Is that right?
Depending on the sizes, yes. And I just want to add here the whole point, our team, my team at ODFW is characterizing the bays and estuaries, eelgrass beds, the subtidal clam communities. We're also monitoring the abundance, spatial distribution, size, gender, all of that for all of the green crab as well. And we'll be happy to share that information because we've got the data sets here for Oregon.
Awesome. Okay, well, thanks so much, Steve, for joining us tonight. We appreciate all of your years of dedication and research to the Oregon coast. And thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight and asking questions. And we will see you on the next webinar. Have a great
All right,
evening.
thanks very much.
Bye.